imagine an opportunity to come together with the foremost thinkers of our time and explore different possibilities for peace. Euphrates Summit, Our World Beyond 9/11.
Our next speaker is the president and founder of the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy, the ICRD. Dr. Douglas Johnston is a distinguished graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy and holds a master's degree in public administration and a PhD in political science from Harvard University. Among his government assignments, he was Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Director of Policy Planning and Management in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and Planning Officer with the President's Office of Emergency Preparedness. He has taught courses in international affairs and security at Harvard and was the founder and director of the university's executive program in national and international security. Dr. Johnston is a captain in the Naval Reserve and, at the age of 27, was the youngest officer in the Navy to qualify for command of a nuclear submarine. I was 28, so you bite me, right? Dr. Johnston's hands-on experience in the political military arena, coupled with his work in preventive diplomacy, has guided the work of ICRD since its inception. In 2007, he received the Founding Spirit Award for Faith by the Washington Times at its 25th anniversary celebration, and in 2008 was identified in a leading Christian journal as the father of faith-based diplomacy. Please help me welcome Dr. Douglas Johnston.
Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be with you today, and I'm very delighted and grateful to Principia and Euphrates Institute in particular for inviting me to be with you. It's a real privilege to be among the speakers that you have today. What I'd like to do, you heard some this morning about national security, and I'd like to try to provide a segue from that into the kind of work that we've been doing. For about 2 decades now, defense planners in the Pentagon have been wrestling with the challenges of what's called the asymmetric threat. For those of you who might not know what that means, it's a term of art that's meant to describe an attack by unconventional creative means that a disadvantaged opponent uses against a more powerful adversary. Much like bin Laden did on 9/11 that rocked this nation back on its heels. Now in response to that, they've come up with a concept called irregular warfare, which calls for a much tighter coordination between defense, development, and diplomacy, all to the good. But frankly, there's not enough money in Western treasuries to protect any country from the full spectrum of possible asymmetric threats. And what you really need is an asymmetric counter, one that gets at the ideas behind the guns. Now that sounds reasonably straightforward, but it's made more complicated by the religious nature of those ideas. And that's not good news for the United States, because of the considerable gap that exists between religion's influence in the world today and our country's inability to deal with it. The looming specter of religious extremism married to weapons of mass destruction only underlines the urgency of the need to bridge this gap. Well, one approach that has shown unusual promise for doing so is a new form of engagement called faith-based diplomacy. What is that? Well, at the macro level, it simply means incorporating religious considerations into the practice of international politics. At the micro level, it means actually making religion part of the solution in some of these identity-based conflicts that exceed the grasp of traditional diplomacy. Now, this kind of activity was dealt with at some length in a new book that came out earlier this year called Religion, Terror, and Error, with the subtitle of U.S. Foreign Policy and the Challenge of Spiritual Engagement. I'd like to just read you 2 sentences from the foreword to that book, which was written by retired Marine Corps General Anthony Zinni, who's the former Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Central Command, and after that, U.S. Special Envoy to the Middle East. Here's what he says. This is a visionary approach that goes beyond the whole of government effort and which expands the current definition of smart power. From my 2 decades of experience in the Islamic world, I'm convinced that the vast majority of Muslims would embrace this approach as a means of clearly expressing their beliefs and enabling them to understand ours. So since our center's inception in August of 1999, we've been practicing this form of engagement in different parts of the world, starting first in the north of Sudan, Kashmir, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, the Middle East, the United States, and most recently Saudi Arabia. What I'd like to do is just share with you a little bit about our flagship program in Pakistan. For about 8 years, we've been on the ground there, reforming the madrasas. Now, few in the West are mindful of the illustrious history of these religious schools, because from the Middle Ages through the 16th century, they were without peer in the world as institutions of higher learning. Indeed, it was only European exposure to them that gave birth to our own university system in the West. And you would be astounded at how many of the traditions and wars of academia trace their roots to the madrasas, from the mortar boards and tassels you wear at graduation, funding a chair in a given discipline, the list goes on. Should be no surprise, they were the model. But as far as we know in the West, these are seabeds of terrorism occupied with a sort of a caveman mentality. Well, from their peak, they digressed over time under the impact of British colonialism. Out of a fear of losing their Muslim identity, they purged themselves of all subjects that were deemed to either be secular in nature or Western in their orientation, to the point where the vast majority of these schools today are about rote memorization of the Quran and the study of Islamic principles. Now, our goals there have been twofold. First is to expand the curriculums, include the physical and social sciences, with a very strong emphasis on human rights and religious tolerance. I say human rights, particularly women's rights, and religious tolerance. I think when you consider the fact that we don't pretend to touch the religious core of what they're teaching, it's just entirely too sensitive. But if we do it, we feel if we do a good job on these other two fronts, the religious tolerance and the human rights, that this can smooth a lot of the rough edges. And from the attitudinal surveys that have been taken and independent third-party evaluations of our work, it's a very fair assumption. It is valid and it holds. The second goal, and it's probably even more important, is transforming the pedagogy to create critical thinking skills amongst the youth. When we first started out, if a youngster so much as raised his hand in class, he'd be punished for disrespect. And why this is so important is that when a youngster who may have memorized the Quran from cover to cover, they're pretty clueless as to what it means, because they're not given enough, they're memorizing the original Arabic, and their native language is Urdu. They're not given enough Arabic at that young age to understand something as sophisticated as the Quran. So along comes the local militant, misappropriates a little scripture to recruit these kids to their cause, as all religions are guilty of from time to time, misappropriating scripture. And these youngsters have no ability to challenge or to question. And that's why we consider this so important. Now, at this point in time, we have engaged some 2,909 madrasa leaders from 1,611 madrasas. Now, this stands in marked contrast to the failed attempts by others to rein these schools in, particularly the government of Pakistan. And there's 4 reasons that account for our success. First is ownership. We have done this in such a way that the madrasa leaders feel it's their reform effort, not something imposed from the outside, which means that they have a lot of say in the change process itself, and they come up with great ideas. The lead paragraph in our teacher awareness module is crafted by a madrasa leader, and it's absolutely awesome. Second reason for success is the inspiring them with their own heritage, not only of their own schools, but going back to the early days of Islam, and many of the pioneering breakthroughs in the arts and sciences were attributed to Islam, and including religious tolerance at a time when Christianity was woefully intolerant. Thirdly, and I think this is probably most important, is we ground all suggested change in Islamic principles so that they can genuinely feel they're becoming better Muslims in the process, and they are. And then finally, and this is something we don't talk much about, is we operate from a posture of humility, driven by our awareness that it was the United States that was largely culpable for planting the seeds of jihad in the madrasas in the first place, as we sought to grow holy warriors to evict the godless Soviets out of Afghanistan. Well, the Soviets left, and then so did we. And we've come back, they're doing what we've trained them to do. They've just changed targets. So the humility is well placed. Let me share with you just a couple of anecdotes to try to bring this more alive to you. One of our workshops, one of the participants was a Taliban commander of some renown. And though renowned, he was despondent. He lost 2 sons in the fighting. And he said, "We simply don't know what America wants. They come after us with guns. We have no recourse but to respond in kind." So this led to an invitation for me to come to the mountains to explain to their senior leadership what America wants, which I did 2 months later. In the interim, I did my due diligence at State, Defense, and CIA, what have you, to make sure whatever I said was consistent with U.S. policy. So I go up to the mountains and I walk into a large room that's filled with about 57 Taliban commanders and number of tribal and religious leaders. And I started by saying, look, we're not a government organization, nor have we ever received any funding from our government at that point in time. And I said, while the United States may have made some mistakes of late, it's important for you to remember when they've intervened on behalf of Muslims in Bosnia, Kosovo, Somalia, Kuwait. I said, left untold in most recitations of descriptions of Somalia, the more than 100,000 Somali lives that were saved as a result of the humanitarian aspects of that intervention. I said, but why we're here today is to see if we can build on religious values that we share in common to create a confidence-building measure that can point toward peace. And I said, for you to be able to participate in this exercise, you need to understand the Western perspective of what's going on here. So I told them what America wants, which simply put was to lay down their arms, distance themselves from Al-Qaeda, and to reconcile with the Karzai government. Most of these were from Afghanistan, who had come over the border for this meeting. Then they, over the next couple of hours, there was a lot of dialogue, a lot of venting went on, as one might expect, and there were several penetrating questions that emerged. First one was, what do the American people want? And with that, I breathed a sigh of relief, because it meant they were still cutting us a bit of slack, even though the administration causing them all their problems would have been reelected. And I said, well, simply put, what America wants is peace in the region with democratically stable governments in Iraq and Afghanistan. And then they wanted to know why we were attacking Afghanistan. I said, well, to put it in terms that you hold dear, hospitality, loyalty, and revenge. I said, before we recognized certain members of Al-Qaeda as a threat, we welcomed them into our country, we gave them hospitality, and then without warning on 9/11 they struck. So we wanted revenge. We went to the Taliban government, asked them to turn over Al-Qaeda leadership. They refused, so we attacked. I said, but we did so with a heavy heart, because most Americans have great admiration and respect for the Afghan people, stemming from our common struggle against the former Soviet Union. I said, furthermore, it's important for you to recognize that certain of your tribal leaders are now banding together against Al-Qaeda because they have violated your hospitality. Another question that emerged was why we were attacking Iraq. And there I kind of indicated there was some debate about that, but as far as I was concerned, that too was a matter of revenge because Saddam Hussein had attempted to assassinate an American president. And the final, more difficult question was, why do we support Israel? I really didn't answer that directly. I said we have a strategic relationship with Israel. It isn't going to change anytime soon. But what is changing is our understanding of, compassion for, and support of the Palestinian people. I said over time, that's going to make a difference. Then there was further discussion. We broke for prayer. and came back together in a smaller group to craft this confidence building measure. During that dialogue session, though, at one point, I later learned that a certain fraction of these folks were Al-Qaeda. I'm glad I didn't know it at the time, but during the midst of it, one very tough-looking gentleman stood up and pointed his finger at me, and he says, "I can't talk to you unless you become a Muslim." And I said, "Well," I said, "I don't see a problem." I said, "Muslim means submission to God. We all submit to God, therefore we're all Muslims." And they laughed just like you did, and we went on with our business. Well, later on, I learned from my project director and our Wahhabi indigenous partner, who had spent a better part of a month rounding these people up. They got very uptight at that point, because often that scenario is you convert or you die. And of course, I was totally oblivious to this, and I thought to myself, you know, the Lord really does look out for fools and incompetents. Anyway, we crafted this confidence building measure, which called for establishing a secure zone in the western third of the Afghan province of Nuristan, which was right across the border from where we were, the Malacan Agency of Pakistan. And then to facilitate private development that would bypass the government and the warlords, because the one thing that all of the Taliban commanders shared in common was that they seemed to genuinely care about their people, and they were mortified that none of the billions of dollars that were being spent, at least at that point in time, had found their way to the village level. It was all being siphoned off at higher levels. So we tried that, and it ultimately failed because I couldn't get sufficient traction with NATO to establish the secure zone. But one good thing that did come out of it was 3 months later, I received a call from the Korean ambassador to the United States, who asked me if there was anything our center could do to help free the 21 Korean missionaries who were being held hostage by the Taliban. You may recall that back in 2007. And because of the networking associated with that earlier meeting in the mountains, we were actually able to play an instrumental role in getting them free. So that was a piece of good news. Another anecdote to illustrate what this is about is about 2 years ago, we had a workshop for 16 madrasas surrounding the Swat Valley. You may recall when the Swat Valley was in the news, it was sort of a resort area of Pakistan. It was overtaken by the Taliban, and a lot of really terrible things were happening there. Anyway, towards the end of this workshop, one gentleman stands up, a madrasa leader. Turns out he happened to be a commander in Lashkar-e-Taiba, which is the terrorist group that brought you Mumbai. He stood up and he said, you know, he says, I came here for one reason and one reason only. It's to discredit everything you have to say. He said, but I now stand before you full of rage. Rage because for 26 years I have been studying and teaching the Quran the way it was taught to me. He says, now for the first time in my life, I feel I've sensed the soul of the Holy Quran and its peaceful intent. He says, I now see that the best way to advance Islam is through peace rather than conflict. He says, I'm going to change what I teach my students, and I'm going to tell them why. Well, this is a pretty brave statement. I guess he got away with it because he was a terrorist commander, but this is an area in which you look cross-eyed and you can lose your head. I mean, that's one of the things that's bowled me over about these madrasa leaders. Once you get past that veneer of rage and hostility and engage them, not only do they get it, but they often become champions at great personal risk to themselves. Well, we came back 1 month later, and sure enough, he was doing exactly as he said. He was teaching his students differently. He was telling them why. And moreover, we had with us a CNN team that had been after us for several years to capture some of our work, and we finally broke down, let them come in. And he says it to CNN for God, the entire world to hear. I mean, it was just, the courage is just mind-boggling. One other thing I would just say about that too is you can sit down with a madrasa leader and explain to him why what he's currently doing may be counterproductive, take him through a logic flow to a better conclusion. He's perfectly able to follow the logic flow and embrace the new conclusion. But what he's pretty incapable of doing is initiating the thought process himself. Because, critical thinking is something we're sort of born with over here from birth. It just happens. But in these tradition-bound tribal cultures, there's not a whole lot of room for that. Anyway, another illustration was in the Punjab. We were a workshop at a madrasa, which was known to be a major Al-Qaeda feeder. About a quarter of its graduates went into Al-Qaeda. They didn't go to fight Americans in Afghanistan, though, because of their geometric proximity. They became part of the militant movement in Kashmir. And midway through, one of the participants raised his hand. He says, "Waging jihad in Kashmir sanctioned by Islam?" And our project director said, "No, it's not, but I'm not a religious leader." So he turned to our indigenous partner, the Wahhabi partner, Ali Hadith, as he's called over there, who enjoys at least honorary mullah status. He says, "No," he says, "never to acquire territory, only to defend the faith." Well, this led to a heated debate between the madrasa leaders, and they came up with a consensus conclusion that the fighting in Kashmir was politically motivated but not religiously sanctioned. So then they started asking themselves, okay, how can we tone down the militancy of our graduates? You know, this is the business, the ideas behind the guns I'm talking about here. And I was very surprised 2 trips later to Pakistan to see this episode was captured in a newspaper way over in Balochistan, half a country away. So the word really, really travels fast. I could go on and on with anecdotes to explain all this, but let me just conclude by saying that in a context in which religious legitimacy trumps all, the best antidote to religious ignorance is religious understanding. And that's what this faith-based diplomacy tries to be about. In the business of trying to make religion part of the solution in these intractable identity-based conflicts is not without its challenges. It's physically, emotionally, psychologically draining, and it has genuine risks. We all know of the pantheon of spiritually motivated peacemakers who paid the ultimate price. Gandhi, Sadat, Rabin, Martin Luther King Jr., the list goes on. But I submit to you that the stakes are so high that despite the risks and whatever discomfort one may feel in transiting the relatively uncharted water to spiritual engagement, that those stakes are just too high not to give it our best shot. So that's what we're attempting to do, and thank you for the privilege of sharing this with you.